Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
My name is Lora Cecere. I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and it gives me great pleasure today to have a panel of Laura Koxholt and Matt Spooner to talk about the recent research that we have just completed on understanding how we implement AI. This research focuses on what can we learn from past deployments of digital transformation that we can actually apply as we begin our journey on AI. I find that AI is everywhere in vendor language and nowhere in actual deployment. So I think there's a lot we can learn. So welcome, Laura and Matt. Let's get started. Our agenda, we'll start with some introductions so that you know who I am, who Laura is, and who Matt are, and a little bit about their background. We'll talk about what can we learn from digital transformation and how can we apply that to AI transformation. So who's Laura? I want to give you a little bit of background if you're not familiar with the work that I do. I write and do open content research, and I'm followed by 345,000 people on LinkedIn, and I give thanks for that following. And the research I do is open content. So the people that follow me on LinkedIn take my surveys, and then I share the insights through webinars like this. And I ask the business leaders to give their perspective. So Laura and Matt were kind enough to volunteer their time to help us to say what's important to them through what we've got in this research. So Laura and Matt, with no further ado, let's introduce you. Laura, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Laura. And hello again, Matt. So basically, I'm a practitioner researcher, as I like to call myself, because I am this year defending my doctoral thesis with the topic of pharmaceutical supply chain viability. And this is the main component of my work and what you can see on LinkedIn. And I'm a practitioner because I'm also working for quite some time, I would say, though maybe the picture here doesn't show all those years of experience in global distribution and logistics in pharma industry. So awesome. Very, very glad to be here.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, Laura. And Matt, introduce yourself. Now, Matt, I know you're now working in the discrete space, but you've spent quite a bit of time in the general industry. So share a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I would say that I'm a practitioner and thought leader in supply chain. So I've spent most of my, particularly around planning. So I'm at Hitachi Energy, where I lead the planning organization for one of Hitachi's business units. But I've spent a lot of my time, I was at Gartner as an analyst with Gartner for a while, where I was leading Gartner's research on sales and operations planning. I spent time working in strategy at Kinaxis at a software vendor, as well as spending most of my career actually in Ericsson, in a range of different supply chain roles. So I would say that, certainly from a technology side, I've been a user, a buyer, and a seller of technology that gives me a fairly unique perspective around sort of technology and what we loosely call digital transformation.
So I was excited that both of you would join me today because Laura has the pharmaceutical background and the academic background, and Matt, you've got that triangulation of, being a thought leader and also a business leader. And so I thought, what a great panel for us to actually share the research. So let's talk about your current state and your current work environment in manufacturing. Are you dependent on spreadsheets? Did you have a digital transformation initiative? And where are you on AI? Just to kind of set the stage so people know a little bit about you. So Laura, you want to start?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. So basically, dependency on spreadsheet, this is a little bit, I would say, it's just there. I mean, we're talking about digital transformation, but basically when we look at any kind of industry, so not only pharma or, any other, I would say, more advanced industries, the spreadsheets are still there. And I'm not saying that they're everywhere on the organizational scale, right? We do have, when we look the operational perspective, and especially transactions, they have been digitalized as much as possible, right? We do have interfaces with our providers and so on. But when it comes to the decision-making level within the organization, when we go a little bit upper within the organization, this is actually when we see this dependency a little bit more towards, well, we call them spreadsheets, but generally they're Excel, we know that. When it comes to digital transformation initiatives, well, especially in pharma, we have been on this journey for years, right? Because we do have our compliance and our patients that we need to take care of. We do have our regulatory, I would say, requirements. And when it comes to digital transformation, we went from, if you want, from data integrity, from patient data integrity, from serialization. This is something that we've done. Also, blockchain used for serialization. So there are a lot of, I would say, transformation happening at that level. And they were in the same pace as the regulatory authorities asked to do that. So it was more, if you want, it was a more like an external need at that point in time. Now, I would say, again, to the point before, there is still a struggle, I would say, in digitalizing decision making. So this is where, and probably we're going to talk a little bit later when we touch about agentic AI, this is still something that we don't do now for good reasons, again, because in pharma, we are in a very highly regulated space and probably is going to come in the future. But this is where we currently are. Now, when it comes to AI, yes, please.
Yeah, no.
Is that a question?
So when it comes to AI.
Yes. I just wanted to close now for AI strategies. So basically, I think we were calling them AI strategies maybe like 2-3 years ago when there was the first wave of the concept, right, of the life cycle of this concept. But now I think we're a little bit more specific. So we're talking more about ML, we're talking about text mining, data mining. And that's because we started to operationalize more whatever we can work with AI. So we don't really have like an umbrella, and especially as they moved from the IT space, they started to move towards business. This is where it lost a little bit this kind of umbrella term vibe, I would say.
Okay, great. And Matt, yourself?
Yeah, I think in terms of dependency on spreadsheets, I think that every organization to some degree is dependent on spreadsheets, and at Hitachi Energy certainly that's true. I would describe our supply chain as being a very high complexity and relatively low velocity, and that's an environment which lends itself, or the spreadsheets are almost the easiest path to be able to work in that type of environment. But we are trying to reduce that dependency on spreadsheets. So we've just gone through, last year we finished the implementation of SAP S/4HANA, going from 35 different instances of SAP to a single instance. That's almost like setting up a single system of record is the first part of that journey. And so we're now going through a journey to try and reduce the dependency that we have on spreadsheets. And I think that really leads into the digital transformation initiatives. I think it's certainly focused on creating that planning system of record, that single system of record, and then we can start looking at the links, the associated transformations that will allow us to be able to see the entire ecosystem and extending that sort of system of record into different systems of innovation. And that, I think, very much links to different AI strategies. So we have an AI function. We're looking at the different use cases. We've implemented some AI strategies successfully last year with Celonis. We're also looking at exploring new AI strategies, but for very specific use cases, opposed to a very general AI strategy.
Awesome. Well, let's get into the research. So the study was conducted in the November-December timeframe. And again, I think all of the people that took the study, most of them came from my LinkedIn community, and I want to share. My goal is that you give to me and I give back to you. So you can see that most of the respondents are in process-based companies, consumer packaged goods, food and beverage, pharmaceuticals, not as many in discrete, but we do have some discrete inputs. And when we cross-tab the data, I don't see a lot of difference between the process and discrete responses. But when we look at digital transformation and we look at what did we really accomplish with digital transformation? I first heard the word digital transformation in 2015, and I started to ask, what does digital transformation mean, and write about it. And there wasn't a clear definition. And when we look at the ability out of digital transformation projects to get to data, to make decisions, you can see that not stellar results or maximizing the value of analytical technologies. Again, not stellar results for the manufacturers or testing new analytical concepts. Not a lot of, we've really knocked it out of the park as we think about our ability to improve our relationships with data and to improve not only getting data, but driving insights. We're still very dependent on spreadsheets. The large multinational greater than 5 billion has the strongest dependency on spreadsheets. And the gap is that our supply chain planning architectures haven't really served them very well. And, part of that is that traditional advanced planning systems were really designed for regional deployments, not for global multinationals. So it doesn't have the ability to do what if analysis or simulation, or to be able to have a semantic layer, to be able to do things like phase in, phase out, or to understand how an each varies by the demonstration on channels. And so a lot of dependency on spreadsheets. We've not cracked that code. You can see here, the dependency for the large multinational. And within the company and within the network, we haven't really improved either the effectiveness of the decision or the time to make the decision. It's requiring still a lot of dependency on linear planning that is very much about batch jobs. So let me just stop here. Laura and Matt, anything about the data so far that speaks to you? Matt, I'll go with you first.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'm not surprised that there's not very much difference between the different types of manufacturer. Whether you're in discrete or process or CPG, every industry thinks that their industry is unique. And the reality is that we're all dealing with pretty much the same challenges. Maybe some of the timescales and scopes are different, but essentially it's the same challenges. So no surprise in terms of that you're not seeing very big differences between different industry sectors. And I think that when you come to the digital transformation, my personal experience, having, I say, been a user and also been on the vendor side as well, is that I think that the vendors and the consultancies very often sell a dream. They sell some universe that really doesn't exist. And the reality is that most of the solutions, the solutions we're implementing as part of digital transformation tend to work well in one country or one factory, but tend to be very very difficult to scale, at an international level. So what you see is that most organizations, in fact, I don't know of any organization who has a single advanced planning system. I would say that most organizations over $5 billion have 4 or 5 different advanced planning systems that they're using in different parts of their businesses, and they don't really connect them together very well. So I think that what we're seeing is a mismatch in aspiration and reality.
Yeah, I was talking to a CPG customer just last week who had 33 deployments of OMP in manufacturing, 2 deployments of Kinaxis, and a deployment of a different demand planning model. And they didn't have a unified data model, and they hadn't really worked on the semantic reconciliation or the process mining level. So I think we've done a lot of deployment of advanced planning without really thinking about the architectures. Laura, your thoughts?
Yes, no, I echo what Matt said and what you said, Laura. And basically, I mean, I'm also not amazed about what we see here. And I was saying that before, when we look at the operational part, so the silo or the different function, that they have their own North Star system. The problem is when they start to communicate with each other. So basically, if I have a project and I would like to have an analysis, cross-functional analysis, then I would have an export from WMS, I would have an export from regulatory data, I would have an export, for example, from HR data, because I would like to cross-check, some learning, I don't know, some learning curricula or something like that. And what do I do with it? I just put it in Excel. I mean, this is the easiest for me. Like, I would like to have a one-time snapshot of a particular process. This is the way to do it. If I would have to invest in a kind of a layer like a dashboard or something that would allow me to have this visualization, it would take me a lot of time. And probably this is not something that I would want to do it on a regular basis. So I'm not amazed about what we're seeing here. And Excel is still one of the, I would say, methods of choice when we're trying to have a cross-functional or a cross-regional analysis.
Well, and
For
the
sure.
concept of end-to-end planning is sort of, it's ethereal. It really doesn't exist. There's nothing in common between TMS and DRP or between revenue management and demand management. So, the current state is we're still very dependent on spreadsheets. We have a large latency of getting to data, and there are huge gaps between consultants and technologists and business leaders. And, one of the issues is that the business leaders may not understand the language. So they do things like, I want real-time planning, which planning should never be real-time, or, they go with the word of the day, which gets us into word salad, or put out RFPs, which really aren't grounded in the principles of planning. And we go into circular kind of motion where we're not making a lot of progress. So anything else to add here, Matt?
I know I definitely, I mean, and again, having sat on that thought leadership side and the practitioner and the, I guess, supply chain leader side, I think that as a supply chain leader, you're very focused on operational issues and doing the firefighting. And it's actually very, very hard to keep up to date with what the latest thinking is. So to some degree, you're dependent on the consultants and the software industry to inform you. And I find it frustrating and a little bit amusing around the word salad, and trying every time certain analyst firms come up with a new term, trying to go and decipher what this new term is, and it's invariably recycling some capability that had a different term 5 or 10 years ago, and we keep and there's almost an industry in creating these new terms in order to sell us new products.
And the problem I've got, Matt, is a lot of the analysts use a lot of word salad, but don't really test and learn. And, I really valued the time that you and I worked on testing and learning on outside-in planning, right? It's like the concepts really need to be validated by, test and learn. Ronald Reagan, trust but verify, I think really fits here. Laura, anything else to add here?
Yes, so what I wanted to say is that more or less is a two-way street here, this gap between the technology team and the business leaders. So basically, the technology teams, they are building solutions for problems that they understand. Okay, they're not necessarily building something for the problems as they exist on the ground. So the reality, the operational reality. In the same way, the business leaders, they ask from consultants or from technology teams, something with AI or something digital, without actually explaining what does that mean or where would that go. So I totally understand that, and I see that there needs to be and probably this is the result of the, the research, there is a lack of this middle ground, this translation, like this architecture that needs to translate what the business leader wants then in technology lingo, and then the technology language then in operational requirements.
Yeah, I tell business leaders three things. One, never be embarrassed to ask, what does something mean, right? If you hear a word, and it sounds like gobbledygook, ask the person to define it, right? If they're talking about real-time planning, stop and say, how does that fit in our architectures? What is real time? What's the difference between real time and speed of business? And the number one is get past the vagaries and the gobbledygook and the word salad to really talk about real. Second thing that I've observed is the clients that I see that do this best actually have human resource rotation between line of business and IT, so that people will actually experience, and cross the divide. The divide between business leaders and IT is huge. The third thing, and it's not closing, it's getting worse in my research. The third thing is I have a number of clients that have really invested in what's called digital science translators, where they've got data scientists, which when we're going to get into AI, we're going to see that the role of the data scientist on the team is really important. But the business leader doesn't know what RAG is. The business leader doesn't know what the role of machine learning is versus optimization, or the difference between optimization and heuristics, or, how do we really drive discrete event simulation? So, the techniques of schema and read are really very well known by the data scientists, but they don't know the business cases. And so, this translation role where someone can sit in the middle, knows the business, is learning the language, because the world of data science is moving so quickly. I don't know if either of you have seen any of those practices deployed. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so Laura, I want to bring up a point that you've just raised. You talked about the in most organizations, this misalignment between business leaders and IT. And I think it's more extensive than that, because when you look at the technology companies, they employ very, very good IT people. And I don't think that the technology companies actually employ people who have a deep subject matter expertise or deep business level and understanding expertise of supply chain in particular. And to some degree, as a result of that, technology companies develop technology because they can, not because it's actually required.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Yeah. And I find a lot of times people lack, looking at share groups or getting feedback and focus groups from innovators. And most of the time, the technology companies are chasing deals with the late adopters, which drags us down to really drive innovation. And if you bring in somebody from business into a technology company, you got to train them on the methods of building code. I mean, it was a large challenge for me when I went from making ice cream to making software, because I didn't understand practical, pragmatic marketing and how to build code. Laura, your thoughts? Anything to add here?
Yes, so actually, I think again, this gap that we see currently is because of the life cycle of the technology, and also because the learning curve is quite steep
Yes.
nowadays whenever a technology is launched. Because we had the same situation, if you remember, in the past, like when you had someone in your team who knew how to do ODB connections to the access data, but like that person would do only that. But then little by little, these skills, they have been then, I would say, implemented within the business. So you would find someone who knows access, but also knows the business. And I think that we start to see the same thing now. We had also with the dashboards where we had only BI people. And then after that, we had people who we hired, so business people, right, operations and so on, who also knew how to do BI. And now we're going to see the same thing. We go now from pure data science, which is like a pure function within the organization, and we're going to see it little by little, the fact that operations, they will have to have these kind of skills too. So again, I think it's more like a time effect of where we are currently on this life cycle
Well,
curve. Yeah.
and unfortunately, I think we're reactive, right? We get into, shiny object syndrome and don't really sit back and think about business outcomes. So I say to people, let's take the last year and let's look at where you had gaps and let's start there about the data that you have and don't use or the techniques that you can use. And so let's look at what drove digital transformation strategies. What can we learn from this history that can apply to AI? So most companies had a digital transformation strategy. Now, it may not have been effective, but they had it. And these were the areas. So it was all over the board. Few people can define what digital transformation actually meant. But most of the time, it was about improving transactional efficiencies, order to cash, procure to pay. Sometimes it was about improving planning or improving visibility, but we didn't define the term visibility very well. It meant, as many different things as flavors of ice cream in an ice cream shop. And a lot of times it was about speeding up processes, right? So there was a clear definition. And we've got to start with clear definition and outcomes. And you can see there's not a lot of difference between the software provider's view, the consultants, and the manufacturer's view about where they were focused. However, the most successful implementations, when we asked people to rate success, was when the initiative reported to the business leader. And when these teams had data scientists and financial folks on the team. And you can see that most of the digital transformation work was struggling because of reporting relationships to the CIO, which was really focused more on technology for technology's sake. And we have a skewed distribution for innovators, right? We've only got 2% that are the first to try a technology, and we've got 22% that say they're among the first. But most of the market is late adopter and, going to wait and see. And one of the biggest differences in having a successful digital transformation strategy was holistic thinking. So systems thinking, thinking about the supply chain as a complex nonlinear system and looking at design thinking of how can we make this better for specific use cases for the user. So perhaps they don't have to use Excel spreadsheets. And so this combination of critical thinking, of being able to look at the validation of ideas, being able to look at data, systems thinking and design thinking were important. But what we see is not a lot of companies are able to really drive systems thinking. And there's a weakness in design thinking. And the consultants and software providers think that business leaders are far further ahead on these concepts than they are. And one of the issues that I find is in academia, we're not really teaching systems thinking and design thinking. So let me just stop here. And Laura, I know you're currently working on an advanced degree, and your thoughts here around holistic systems thinking, because you're looking at resilience, and I think holistic thinking is really key for resilience. Your thoughts here?
Yes. So, well, I'm not amazed about the correlation that you found in the study. So, systems thinking, I think it could be taught, but more than being taught, it should be actually, I would say, implemented within the organization. I can give you a very simple example. Like for technology, like when you want to build a business case, right? Like I want to check an ROI on an NPV on a project for implementing, I don't know, robotics or an AGV in your warehouse. Typically, the way that business cases, they look at that is just, you just put your cost and you're like, okay, and how much I'm going to save? Well, I'm going to save my forklifter, who sometimes is the lowest paid person probably in a warehouse. And I'm going to put an AGV, it's going to cost me that. Look at this, my CapEx investment is this and this and this. Now, at the end of it, when you start implementing, you realize that basically you removed 1 or 2 forklifts, but then you have to hire 3 engineers. because somebody needs to run, like when something happens with your AGVs, then somebody needs to take care of that. You need to manage a new vendor, for example, which is a technology vendor. You need to think of different way of implementing that. Is it a service? Is not a, so you need to bring capabilities within in the procurement team even that you didn't have before. And then at the end of it, maybe you just need to even invest in your Wi-Fi router or connections that you have, because that thing is not going to work with what you have currently. So basically, in this kind of situation, it's not only to say, well, the warehouse would like to implement robotics, is to say, what is my ecosystem? Like, what are the other functions that are going to be impacted? And how would that be translated when I build a project or when I build a business case, which is not anymore to say, well, warehouse is in the lead, but to say, well, this is a ecosystem that needs to work together. And I think that this is the easiest way of implementing that, is that whenever you go for a technological solution, not to think, well, this point in the network needs to be optimized, is to think, how do I optimize my entire network?
Yeah. Well, and how do I have holistic thinking about the impact of Project A on the outcomes, whether it's perpetual inventory or, how I manage orders or how I affect products. I was talking to a company last week who had implemented hundreds of design projects, using a network planning tool to do design, very focused on cost effectiveness in a function. And they were very proud. They were bragging and beating their chest about how much money they had saved. But I said to them, but some of these supply chains need to be responsive. You're dealing with food products for a fast food chain that has a lot of change, and you've consolidated your inventory with very long lead times. And I question if you're going to be successful. So we need to not only think about cost at a functional level, but total cost and the role of time in driving that optimum response. Matt, your thoughts here about, how do we get to being able to embrace these concepts?
Yeah, so I would say one of the greatest failings, and the reasons for failure, is that it's the traditional way that you create a business case for doing any type of transformation. It basically forces you down a route of trying to either do cost savings or create additional efficiency or inventory reduction, so that that forces you down a very functional route, saying, look, taking my existing functions and how do I do my existing functionality but better. Whereas I think that the most successful way to be looking at this is, how by implementing this transformation am I reducing risk within my value chain? How am I going to increase the market cap of the organization that I work for? And we know that there's not actually a very good correlation between cost reduction and market capitalization.
Exactly.
So we know that these projects are chasing the wrong thing right from the starting point. And I think it's maybe a slight tangent, but I'll tell you a story about visibility, because you were talking about visibility. I was talking to the chief procurement officer, a friend of mine, a chief procurement officer of about a $35 billion organization. And we were discussing visibility of the tier N supply chain. And this chief procurement officer was saying, look, Matt, if I get visibility of the problems within these tier N, it's going to keep me awake at night. And I don't know whether these are problems that need to keep me awake all night or not. So I don't see that visibility is actually something that's terribly attractive to me. And I think what this is a story about is actually creating the capability to provide visibility that I think we would all agree is increased visibility would be a great thing to have. But we also need to think about the visibility linked to the decision support, how do we make better data-driven decisions rather than just creating that visibility. And that's where I think we really go into the design thinking, is we've got to think of not just about these functional capabilities. We need to be thinking really much more about outcomes and about how do we connect different things together to drive the correct outcomes.
Right. Yeah, and so that leads us to how effective were we, right? Yeah, look at planning, not very effective, right? We were much more effective on our transactional systems. And I know, Matt, you like this slide. So tell me why you like this slide.
Yeah, so why do I like this side? So what I think it shows me is that things like automation of factories is highly effective, but it's not seen as terribly important. So automation of factories, I think, has a very clear goal. You can say I'm going to go and put in AGVs in my factories or robots in my factories, and that's going to drive and and I think that because we're very clear about those goals, we can say, yeah, actually, this is a very effective transformation. Then when we look at something like planning, which is seen as being highly important to all organizations, it's unlikely you're ever going to speak to an organization who's going to say planning is not one of their top three agenda items, in the next few years. But we're not trying to think differently about planning processes. I think we're putting in place transformations, we're putting in place AI, we're doing without actually fundamentally questioning what is planning, what are the outcomes, what are the very clear outcomes that we want to have from improved planning. And so this is why I think that you see it being highly important, but the effectiveness of the transformations, I think, is very poor.
Yeah, and if we look at automation of factories, often that's for improving OEE or, outcomes of factories. But, as you and I know, that reducing manufacturing costs doesn't necessarily translate to operating margin. And I can make the factories really much more efficient, but throw the supply chain out of balance because, maybe I don't need that product, right? And so efficient factories struggle with driving outcomes for agile supply chains. Laura, your thoughts about this slide?
Well, I can't say that I like it as much as Matt
Okay.
likes it. I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to say that it makes sense because, and I think we talked also previously about that, is the fact that whatever is more effective is what can be seen, right? Like if you have like nice dashboards and KPIs, then, oh, you have better visibility. Here you go. Your digital transformation project was effective. Well done. Then you sped up the processes. You put like 3 bots. You implemented Copilot. Well done. You sped up the process. So you can see that actually the effectiveness is more, I would say, more judged in terms of technological KPIs. And this is one of the things when we were talking earlier about how technology leaders see these projects versus business leaders, is that it's very easy to track the progress of a project in terms of how that project goes, right? Like what it delivers at the end. But as long as it's not really linked to operational objectives, and that's where probably this idea of having the system thinking would work and would help, actually. As long as we are still in that kind of a very, very transactional piece and we measure transactions, yeah, we're going to be very effective. Does that mean that we improved any other type of KPIs in terms of, I would say patient satisfaction or anything else that we want to measure within our organization? I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical.
All right. So essentially, digital transformation worked better if we had a higher level of systems thinking, if we had presence of data scientists and finance on the teams. It was better for early adopters, and if it reported to business leaders. So if we think about AI strategies, we talk about AI, but AI is not AI. We've got machine learning and reinforcement learning and deep learning and unstructured text mining and large language models and agentics and agents. And we're talking about technology for technology's sake, not necessarily talking about outcomes and governance and what makes a good plan. And so we run the risk, I think, of putting agents on top of bad architectures and doing what I call AI stupid. And, currently we're more dissatisfied than satisfied with the current work that we're doing in AI because I think we're so caught up in the gobbledygook of, shiny objects and not really thinking about outcomes. And, the technologists are facing, how do they chase the RFIs and the RFPs and the software providers. And so we're in the bit of, the chase, the cat chasing the tail or the dog chasing the tail. So Matt, your thoughts about AI as we look at these learnings from digital transformation?
Yes, I mean, AI, and I think I'm hoping we're over the height of elevated expectation in the hype cycle at the moment on AI, because it's been sucking the energy almost out of everything. In AI replaces everything. I've got a lot of people who I know, a lot of academics in the optimization and the operations research space, and there's this huge frustration that it's almost that AI replaces everything that optimization can do, and OR has been spent years and years looking at and can do, and it doesn't. So there's this, I think, this huge overinflated expectation about the capabilities of AI, and I think that's leading to these frustrations, and part of it is because most large organizations have been thinking that they're being left behind because the consultants, the big strategy consultants, have been telling their clients, oh, but these clients have been implementing these wonderful AI solutions, and there's almost like the FOMO fear, the fear of missing out that organizations have been feeling on AI, and and then they start experimenting, and I think this leads to this frustration, and maybe it's frustrations because the organization's feeling that they're missing something, they're not understanding something. What I'm beginning to see, though, and I think if you look at this in a year or 2 years' time, I think you might see a very different view, because I think that now big organizations are getting far better educated in AI and the capabilities of AI. They're realizing that AI is not magic, that very often it's a bit of a conjuring trick, it's a bit of an illusion, but it does have really good applications going forward. And so I'm positive about AI. I think that AI does have the ability to transform business and transform the way that we look at supply chains and operations. And I'm just hoping that we can get over this hype and actually start looking at the real applications of AI that will make a big difference.
Well, I think people are frustrated because we certainly had a lot of digital transformation in our personal lives with the mobile phones and, sensors, cameras. But we didn't have that same level of digital transformation in our supply chains, and the same thing's happening with AI. If you look at, Copilot, or you look at what's happening in our Microsoft Office types of technologies, lots happening. It's fun. But, as we think about supply chain, I think we struggle with the same adoption of, how do we make supply chains better? So Laura, any thoughts here?
Yeah, for sure. So I think this frustration or this gap between, expectations of using AI in day-to-day life and in organizational life is driven by the fact that, again, because we use this kind of overall term AI, we just need to be, aware of the fact that as private individuals, we also use AI as a productivity tool, right? So if you compare that to the organizations, it works. Like, you have AI everywhere. They're transcribing all your meetings, minutes. You don't need to have administrative support. So from that perspective, if you look at one-to-one, people probably, they have other expectations, but it works. So productivity, AI in productivity space, it works. Now, when it comes to a different type of industries, and here specifically for pharma or finance, where you have a very high regulatory aspect, AI starts to take a back seat. And that's because there is a question of governance. I think we touched previously about that. And the fact that you can't just implement something without having all the processes around it then changed, and you need to have a human in the loop. So somebody who's actually taking responsibility, who takes over the liability, and if something happens, then they are going to be, then it's their responsibility, and it's under their purview. So
Yeah.
Yes, it's nice, AI, and the gap is there, but basically, we need a little bit more. And I'm as optimistic as Matt is. I think in 1 or 2 years, we're going to be a little bit more specific about what we want.
Well, I hope so. In my writing, I use Grammarly a lot. I'm actually doing images for the blog using AI. It's great. But this alignment issue between business and IT, we've really got to think hard about, because it was a barrier for digital transformation, and it'll continue to be a barrier for the adoption of AI. So my recommendation is that people test and learn and get an understanding of different forms of AI, and really not just think about implementing technology for technology's sake, but redefine work. And be honest, our current processes don't work very well for the large multinational, and we shouldn't just put AI on top of existing processes, and train your teams on systems thinking. So let's wrap up. As I look at the data, I say, let's avoid hype cycles. We need to be clear on what are the outcomes for AI, not talk about AI for AI, but talk about different types of technologies and how we drive outcomes. The largest opportunity and the biggest challenge is with the larger companies. And we've got to close these gaps between the technologists and the business leaders to be able to drive better outcomes. So any final thoughts, Laura?
Well, I think I've said a lot.
Okay.
No, I think the last part is really about this piece about redefining work. And I really like that, about the fact that we need not to think, to your point, well, we have a nice tool, let's just implement the tool, but to think, well, this tool is going to change the process. So the process should lead, and after that, the tool should follow, basically. So the tool should always follow process, which is one of my mantras. And I'm totally optimistic about how AI is going to look in the future, and the benefits it's going to bring, as long as we indeed take a very honest look of what we do. And if we manage to implement, to optimize the process, the tools will follow for sure.
Well, I'm hoping we can learn from the past and not be, repeating the problems. Matt, any final words before we close?
I think that it's I guess my main thing on this is really about outcomes, and it's probably what Laura's saying about the tools following the process. We actually need to think about what are the outcomes of the processes that we're looking at. I think we need to be looking at the technology, and what options does the technology give us to think differently, and can we reinvent and reimagine some of the processes that which exist because the technology was never capable in the past to support, and suddenly we have technology that is now able to support things that were just not possible in the past. So I would say we need to take this as an opportunity to rethink the way that we work as well.
Let me thank Laura and Matt for joining me today. People that filled out the survey will be invited to a roundtable to continue the dialogue. And if you have questions, because we've pre-recorded this, please send them to me through direct message on LinkedIn. I'll be glad to answer your questions on my blog. And again, thank you. And Supply Chain Insights is all about open content research to try to help business innovators. I'm hoping we can learn from the past, to unlearn, to rethink, to drive unprecedented levels of value. But we can't just repeat the issues we've had in the past. Thank you very much.